Hey, my name is Titus. I am going through Ed Welch's article called Self-Injury When Pain Feels Good. I think it's been really helpful. I chose the article because self-injury is something that I don't know much about. I've never experienced it. As far as I'm aware, I don't really have a lot of people in my life that have experienced it or been open with it. And so I think it was something that was really interesting to me. I just wanted to learn more about it and learn how God's Word applies to it. I think Ed Welch does a really good job of just kind of outlining what it is and why people do it. I think as a thesis, he talks a lot about people do what they do for a reason. It's not illogical, it's not nonsensical. People think that it's right and think that they have to. And so he talks a lot about how sometimes causing ourselves physical pain actually seems to make the situation better, seems to make ourselves feel good and make things seem to go well, but ultimately actually puts us right back where we started. He eventually describes it as a cycle. I think this is helpful, and he talks about it often starts with stress. From there goes to some form of self-harm, often cutting, something like that, which for a while goes to relief, and the pain is good and things go better, but then it'll ultimately end up back in guilt because there's an unchanged situation. Things haven't really changed. Maybe they seem to be better for a little while, but they didn't ultimately change, and ultimately that will bring someone back to stress again. And so he describes it as a cycle that continues until someone breaks out of it. And he talks a lot about the pain that someone would feel. There's a pain of staying in the same spot. You're always going to stay here. You're always going to be hurting yourself. But then there's a pain of change, of trying to break that cycle and telling someone, and the shame that can bring. And so I think it was really an insightful article, really helpful in just learning how to think about these things. I think something that was really helpful to me, I think I really like that Ed Welch seems to, one, think through things very well, but two, he doesn't just cast them aside and say that that's a nonsensical thing to do, it's sin, you shouldn't do it. But I think he does a good job of listening and responding well. I bring this up. One point that he had that was really helpful to me was he talks about how self-harm is primarily about one's view of God. So more than it is of how they view themselves or other people, it's primarily about how they view God. He mentions that something that's common for someone who is struggling with self-harm is a feeling that they need to hurt themselves to make things better, that they failed or something's wrong, and so they need to hurt themselves in order to make things better and to progress in life and to do well. And so I think something he does well is he compares them actually to Old Testament Jews. And on page 5 of the article, he says that as the Jews felt that, and rightly so, that when they sinned, they needed to make a sacrifice to atone for their sin. He kind of compares them and says, you kind of feel the same way when you feel that you've done wrong. You feel this need to make penance, to hurt yourself, to make things right again. And I think a quote that was really helpful, on page 5, he says, addressing someone who struggles with self-harm, he says, "You have it partly right. When you feel wrong or unclean, blood is the answer. Actually, death is the answer, and blood symbolizes this price that must be paid for our guilt. But what you deny is that only Jesus' death is able to truly wash your soul." I think it's just really helpful, and I think it's really caring in a really helpful way of understanding what someone's thinking when they're wrestling with self-harm, as well as how to help us think through helping someone who is in that situation. I think he just does a good job of saying these people aren't just doing it because they woke up one morning and decided to, but there's reasons, and they feel like they have to. They feel like they don't have a choice. Because of time, I won't go into all of them, but he gives 8 reasons why someone would struggle with self-harm, and I think they're really helpful. They stem from people who feel that they're guilty and they need to be punished, as well as people who are angry at maybe themselves, angry at others. Maybe they're trying to get back at them. It can also be that sometimes people feel like there's a whirlwind of emotions going on around them, all these things happening, and they don't have any control, and they don't always know how to express themselves, how to accurately communicate what they're feeling. And so he helpfully, I think, points out that oftentimes people struggle with self-harm because they feel that it's something that they can control, and because they feel that it gives them a category. Maybe they don't exactly know how to communicate some of these things, but when they're in pain, when they're doing it to themselves, it gives them a self-controlled category that they can kind of think through and work with, which I thought was helpful in just understanding why someone would think that this is helpful to them, and why someone would think that this is good for them. I think, in short, the struggle that the article is addressing, he's writing to someone who is struggling with self-harm, or maybe someone whose maybe child is, or brother or sister or a close friend. He's writing to someone who's in close proximity with someone who's struggling with this. And he's mainly addressing the pain of change on the one hand, of coming clean, and the shame and the guilt that one would bear. And he's contrasting that with the pain of staying the same, of you stay in the same cycle and you keep going and it never ends. I think two verses that were really helpful that he brought up, James 4, 1-3, he talked a lot about how our problem is not primarily that we just don't love ourselves enough, but rather it's normally that we love ourselves too much, but we don't understand what love really is. And so he uses James to talk about our passions, that are at war within us, or what causes quarrels in us, and I think he helpfully points out that we don't accurately have an understanding of love. If we did, we would see the selfless love of Jesus, and so when it's a self-focused love, that we love ourselves too much and we're too prideful in, it can often lead us to do things like self-harm, or things like that it stems from a misunderstanding of love, but a misunderstanding of the love that God has shown us. I think another passage, I won't look into it specifically, but he looks at a number of Psalms on page 8 of the article. I think it's really helpful because he just kind of lays out for someone who's struggling, and he just says, maybe you feel like you don't have the words to communicate, but the good news is that in God's word, he's given you the words to adequately show what you're going through, whether that's turmoil, or whether it's good, or whether it's just normal life. And so I think he does a really good job of saying that God has met you. When you didn't desire him, God met you, and he actually gave you the words that you need to communicate and to live life the way that you were intended. And I think his article is really helpful in just learning how to think through it, as well as just seeing how God's word applies to someone who's struggling with that. Thanks.